This warning from the CEO of the nation's largest automaker, General Motors, about the impact of the tariffs on the car industry. The federal government is playing hardball after two automakers dropped some Canadian car production. In Canada's auto sector, General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plant near London, Ontario. General Motors saying today it is ending production of its Bright Drop electric delivery van in Ingersoll, Ontario. Something unexpected is unfolding in Ontario, and it's quietly redefining the future Canada thought it had mapped out. A few years ago, the country's leaders stood before cameras promising a new electric age, cleaner, smarter, and full of opportunity. Factories were revived, investments poured in, and one town in particular, Ingersoll, became the face of that transformation. The Cami plant was hailed as a national milestone, producing Bright Drop electric vans that symbolized progress and pride. But now the production lines have stopped moving and the optimism that once filled the air has started to fade. Behind closed doors, workers wait for clarity, suppliers weigh their losses, and communities search for stability in a changing industry. Yet, instead of the panic often seen in similar crises, there's a measured calm spreading through Ontario's industrial towns, as if they've been expecting this moment all along. What allowed Canada to brace for impact when others stumbled? Is this calm confidence proof of real strength? Or is something else hidden beneath the surface of that resilience? When General Motors announced it would halt production of its Bright Drop electric vans in Ontario, the news spread through the industry like a shockwave. The Cami Ingersoll plant had been more than a workplace. It was a symbol of confidence, proof that Canada's electric dream was within reach. That silence on the assembly floor felt heavier this time. It wasn't the kind of pause that precedes recovery, but the kind that forces an entire nation to take stock. Workers had lived through slowdowns before, yet this one cut deeper. The closure didn't feel isolated. It echoed a larger disruption that had begun far beyond Canadian borders in the political corridors of Washington. The chain reaction started when the Trump administration implemented a 25% tariff on Canadian-built vehicles. What seemed like a policy move aimed at protecting American manufacturing quickly began eroding the foundation of cross-border trade. For decades, automakers relied on a tightly woven network between the U.S. and Canada, where parts and vehicles moved fluidly in both directions. That balance shattered almost overnight. Within months, production costs climbed sharply, parts shortages grew, and logistics delays turned once efficient systems into financial burdens. GM's own reports showed losses exceeding $1 billion in a single quarter, with annual projections spiraling toward $5 billion. Executives were left with difficult choices, and the Bright Drop plant became one of the casualties of that recalibration. But as pressure mounted in the U.S. auto sector, the story north of the border took a very different turn. Canada's reaction was not one of panic, but precision. The federal government acted swiftly, deploying a range of measures designed to stabilize rather than retaliate. Within weeks, relief packages were in motion. Tax credits for manufacturers, grants for regional suppliers, and programs that reinforced key links in the supply chain. Ottawa focused on insulation instead of escalation, creating a buffer between local industries and global volatility. Smaller Canadian suppliers, long dependent on imported American parts, began investing in domestic alternatives. That quiet shift strengthened national self-reliance and began reshaping the industrial ecosystem from the ground up. While U.S. factories experienced cascading disruptions, Canadian operations maintained balance and continuity. The approach was calm, deliberate, and rooted in long-term thinking. A strategy that soon began to separate Canada's performance from its struggling neighbor. The story unfolding in Ontario wasn't simply about tariffs. It was also about how a nation confronted both economic and environmental challenges with adaptability. Electric vehicles, for all their promise, face a unique obstacle in colder regions. Sub-zero temperatures can dramatically reduce battery efficiency and range. Studies from the Canadian Automobile Association found that EV range can drop between 14% and 39% in temperatures ranging from -7 to 15 degrees Celsius. For fleet vehicles like Bright Drop vans, those numbers were more than statistics. They represented failed delivery targets, higher maintenance costs, and logistical headaches during long Canadian winters. Nearly two-thirds of EV owners reported performance declines in freezing weather, making the northern climate a formidable barrier to large-scale electrification. Rather than surrender to those limitations, Canada treated them as challenges to be engineered away. Across Ontario, startups and research institutions began experimenting with new materials and cold-resistant battery chemistries. University labs collaborated with private manufacturers, testing innovations that could sustain performance in extreme cold. Logistics giants such as Purator and Canada Post started transitioning to hybrid and hydrogen-powered fleets, diversifying their technology to keep operations reliable throughout the year. What began as a technological obstacle turned into an accelerator for innovation. Canada's most persistent environmental hurdle became the very force driving its engineering breakthroughs. Beneath these efforts was a philosophy that had been shaping Canada's economic framework for years. Policymakers had quietly built what economists now call a shock absorber economy, a structure designed to withstand sudden disruption without collapsing. It was an approach based on foresight rather than reaction. Between 2020 and 2024, Canada attracted more than $46 billion in EV-related investments supported by over $52 billion in public incentives, the highest ratio among G7 nations relative to GDP. Those numbers represented more than government spending. They reflected an entire mindset built on flexibility, cooperation, and preparedness. That framework included several critical safety nets. A $5 billion response fund supported companies directly affected by tariffs. The Regional Manufacturing Stabilization Program doubled its capacity from $450 million to $1 billion to safeguard production centers like Ontario and Quebec. Meanwhile, a national retraining initiative worth $450 million aimed to transition over 50,000 workers into the growing EV and battery sectors. Together, these measures formed a web of support strong enough to absorb the economic shock waves from Washington's policies. What followed was a rare outcome in modern industrial economies. Workers kept their jobs, factories stayed active, and communities avoided the collapse many had feared. The result wasn't only stability, it was confidence. That confidence became the key differentiator between Canada and the United States. While GM struggled with ballooning costs south of the border, operations in Canada remained stable. In the U.S., note the company spent roughly $4.5 billion covering additional tariff costs and another $4 billion on restructuring its supply chain. The American market, once seen as a stronghold, was now weighed down by policy unpredictability and political friction. Meanwhile, Canada offered what GM needed most: stability, predictable energy prices, consistent policy direction, and an increasingly skilled workforce created a business climate that allowed companies to plan beyond the next quarter. Analysts began referring to Canada as GM's reliability anchor, a place where the company could weather volatility without halting progress. Ontario soon became the center of gravity in this transformation. Massive projects like Volkswagen's St. Thomas battery plant and Stellantis LGS's Windsor facility drew in networks of suppliers, engineers, and technicians. The region evolved into a tightly linked ecosystem that could design, build, and assemble electric vehicles with minimal dependence on foreign inputs. Unlike the fragmented industrial landscape seen elsewhere, Ontario's structure fostered collaboration at every level. From research labs to assembly lines, as the U.S. auto sector struggled through layoffs and rising costs, Canada's EV transition continued to accelerate. The bright drop halt, while unsettling, became a moment of clarity. It exposed Canada's vulnerability to foreign market swings, but also highlighted the potential for transformation. Policymakers recognized the need to reduce reliance on U.S. demand and began working toward a fully self-sustained EV network within national borders. This effort evolved into a movement known as Made in Canada Mobility. Its goal was to build an end-to-end supply chain that would allow the country to mine, refine, manufacture, and export EV technology independently. The foundation of that plan began in Canada's resource-rich north, where deposits of nickel, lithium, and cobalt, key minerals for battery production, were being redirected from export to domestic use. Processing facilities once outsourced to Asia were revived locally, enabling Canada to refine its own materials and feed its own production network. The entire cycle from mining to final assembly was being brought home. Public investment led the way, accounting for nearly 14% more funding than private spending, signaling that Ottawa viewed industrial independence not as an option, but as a national priority. In Ontario, the effects of this reinvention were visible almost everywhere. Cities like Windsor and Alist, once defined by traditional assembly line work, began transforming into centers of advanced research and high-tech innovation. Collaboration between universities, corporations, and startups created new industrial clusters built around clean energy and sustainable design. The province's shift from a manufacturing base to a hub of technological advancement was gradual but unmistakable. It marked the birth of a new industrial identity, one centered on resilience rather than reliance. Beyond the continent, Canada's ambitions began reaching across the Atlantic. Trade agreements with the European Union opened new pathways for collaboration in clean manufacturing and carbon-neutral battery exports. By 2026, Canada positioned itself to deliver low-emission, fully traceable supply chains that met Europe's strict sustainability standards. This strategic pivot toward Europe was more than a trade move. It was a reorientation of Canada's economic geography. Diversifying exports away from near-total U.S. dependence gave the country greater flexibility in an increasingly uncertain global economy. This shift carries weight far beyond simple trade data. It represents a fundamental redrawing of North America's industrial map. Where Detroit and Texas once defined the pulse of automotive manufacturing, Ontario and Quebec are now stepping into that space. Through steady planning and measured innovation, Canada is reshaping its role on the global stage. Its economy has become a model of stability amid chaos, a demonstration of how quiet endurance can outlast short-term volatility. The bright drop pause, once seen as a setback, ultimately became a test of resilience. It revealed how deeply Canada's economic safeguards had been built into the system. Each stage of the response, from government strategy to local execution, worked in harmony, proving that national policy could protect both industry and labor without sacrificing innovation. While other countries continue to react to shifting markets, Canada has managed to stay focused, turning each disruption into an opportunity to refine its own foundations. Now, General Motors continues operating in Canada, relying on its facilities and workforce to maintain progress in an increasingly competitive market. Economists now describe the Canadian model as one of the most successful examples of long-term industrial adaptability in the Western world. Its strength lies not in sudden recoveries or luck, but in consistency and foresight. Through years of preparation and collaboration, Canada built the capacity to withstand the turbulence that has shaken much of the global economy. In an era defined by uncertainty, that stability has become its most valuable export. While other nations struggle to find footing in the transition to electrification, Canada has turned volatility into momentum, quietly positioning itself as the cornerstone of North America's clean energy future. And as the electric age reshapes global alliances and supply chains, one question still lingers in boardrooms and policy circles alike. If Canada can remain steady through this kind of turbulence, can North America's supply chain truly operate without Canada at its core? Moreover, growing tension is unfolding across the global auto industry as leading manufacturers rally against a looming round of U.S. tariffs, this time aimed at factory robots and industrial machinery. The Alliance for Automotive Innovation, representing almost every major automaker, including GM, Toyota, Volkswagen, and Hyundai, has urged Washington to rethink the plan. Their message is straightforward. Taxing the machines that drive American manufacturing could end up hurting it, raising costs, slowing production, and tightening supply at a moment when car prices are already soaring. Nearly 40% of all robotics and industrial equipment operating in U.S. factories are tied to vehicle production, making the auto sector particularly exposed to new trade restrictions. Automakers warned that penalizing these technologies would disrupt assembly lines and force companies to absorb steep financial losses or pass them on to consumers. Either option could undercut the fragile rebound of the car market. Tesla, although not part of the alliance, echoed the warning. The company argued that tariffs on production equipment would hinder factory growth, delay critical upgrades, and weaken America's position in the global electric vehicle race. Slowing innovation, it said, would not only affect automakers, but the broader transition toward cleaner, more advanced industries. At a time when inflation, labor shortages, and shifting trade alliances already challenged the economy, these tariffs could further complicate recovery. The decision now facing Washington carries enormous weight. The decision now facing Washington carries enormous weight. Will protecting domestic manufacturing through new tariffs bring long-term stability, or will it create new barriers that slow progress? What do you think? Are these tariffs a safeguard for America's future, or another setback that risks stalling innovation and raising prices even further? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And before you leave, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in the next.